Hello, everybody. Sorry we are a couple of minutes late, just a slight technological hitch with the audio equipment, but we are all ready to go now. Hello to everybody. We're going to be doing a session this week on pivot table tips and tricks. It's going to be delivered by Deb. Deb is my colleague, and she is a master of Excel. I always embarrass her by going a little bit over the top, so this week I shall just tell you that you won't find anybody better to teach you in the world. Deb is a Microsoft Office specialist, and she's going to be able to answer pretty much all of your questions. But anything that you want to ask, you just please put it in the questions box. And anything that if there's something that just plagues us a little bit too much today, or if we don't have time, we will give you an email afterwards with an answer to your question. As we're running late, I'll keep this brief and introduce Deb pretty much immediately. So thanks to everybody, and welcome to Deb.
Thank you so much, James. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar of 2017. I know we're 3 weeks into January now, but I'd just like to wish you all a very happy new year. And I'm not going to waffle on too much because, as I said, we are running a little bit behind. So we're just going to jump straight into the slides, I think. I think James has done a good enough job of introducing me. As he said, he does normally embarrass me, and this week I'm feeling a little less embarrassed, so that's good. Let's jump into just talking a little bit about what we're going to look at in the webinar today. So we're going to talk a little bit about pivot tables. Now, for some people, pivot tables are a love-hate thing, and I thought I would illustrate that by bringing up on our slide a jar of Marmite, which for those of you on the call today, if you're in the UK, you're going to know exactly what I mean by seeing this slide. However, if you're joining us from another country and you may not be quite as aware of what this means, we often say here that Marmite is a love or hate thing. People either love it or they hate it, and Marmite is a food item which we tend to spread on our toast in the morning, and it has a very strong, strange taste, and some people love it. I love it. James, do you love? And James loves Marmite as well, but there's a vast majority of people that you meet that will hate Marmite, and that is kind of the way that some people feel about pivot tables as well. For those people that use pivot tables often, they find them incredible, amazing tool for lots of data analysis. If you're not quite as familiar with pivot tables, then you'll probably, if somebody was to say to you, can you do me a pivot table, you're probably going to freak out a little bit, and some people really do hate them. And the reason why they hate them is that they think that they're difficult. And really, my only aim today is that by the end of this session, you go away feeling a lot more comfortable with pivot tables. They're actually really, really easy to do, and they are extremely useful. So this is what we're going to cover in the session today. Again, I'll just tell you a little bit, a general overview about what pivot tables are and how they're used. We'll then jump straight into formatting data, so how you can take your raw data, clean it up, ready for use in a pivot table. We'll then go in and we'll create a pivot table, and I'll show you how you pivot that pivot table, which is the whole point of a pivot table. We'll then look at some of the things you can do to configure a pivot table, and also how you can use external data sources. So a lot of our examples, we're going to be using data that I already have in an Excel spreadsheet, but we're going to also look at how you pull data in from an external data source as well. We're going to take a look at how you manage pivot table data and also how you summarize data, so just some utilities and some tools which you can use when you're in your pivot table that you might find useful. We're going to take a look at filtering a pivot table using something called slicers, which may or may not be something that you're aware of. Slicers, I love slicers. They were a new feature in Excel 2013, I believe, and they're really useful when it comes to pivot tables, particularly if you're creating a pivot table that you're going to share with other people, or you're creating kind of like a dashboard in Excel to represent data that you want to send to others. It makes filtering a pivot table super simple. Anybody can do it using slicers. We're going to take a look at how you format a pivot table so it's easier to read for everyone, and also how you can use conditional formatting within your pivot table. And then finally, we'll end the session just by showing you very quickly how to create a pivot chart. Pretty much, if you can create a pivot table, you can very easily create a pivot chart, so nothing too complex there. And hopefully, I'm going to explain it in a way that's going to make this seem really, really easy, we can hope. So let's just talk about that first question first of all. So what are pivot tables? And I always like to illustrate it with this slide here from my favorite episode of Friends, where Ross and Rachel are trying to move a couch up the stairs, and Ross is just screaming pivot the entire time. It always reminds me, whenever I think of pivot tables, for some reason I have exactly this come into my brain. So I'm just going to leave that up there while I talk to you a little bit about exactly what a pivot table is. So pivot table, it's a way of analyzing data. So the amount that you use pivot tables will really depend on the kind of job role that you have. So if you're somebody who maybe just does a few formulas, maybe does some formatting in Excel, then maybe pivot tables might be a bit overkill for your needs. However, if you do a job role where you deal with large amounts of data, or you need to extract specific things out of that data, then pivot tables are invaluable to anybody who does that kind of thing. And all we mean by a pivot table, it's just basically, if you think of it like a table, but it just means that it's movable. So you can move around the column headings and column rows, move them around in a certain way so that that data displays differently. And you can carry on pivoting them just by moving the column headings around, which makes it a very dynamic kind of table. That's really what a pivot table is in a nutshell. So without further ado, let's minimize PowerPoint, and we're going to go into our first exercise. So the way that I like to structure these sessions, if this is your first one with me, is it's all live demos. So we're going to go through some exercises, and I will be going fairly quickly because we don't have that much time, and I am trying to cover as much as I can. But just remember that we are going to be recording, or we are recording this webinar, and that is available after the session. So if I'm going a little bit too fast for you to write notes, then you can review that recording afterwards. All right, so let's start out.
Sorry to interrupt everybody, but if you do want a recording of the webinar, please just send an email to info@webinarsteam.com. Sorry, carry on, Deb.
Wonderful, thank you, James. All right, let's start out by taking a look at how a pivot table should look. So this is kind of a pivot table that's already been done, just to give you an idea of what we're aiming for. All right, so this is a pivot table. I don't have too much data. Now, all of the examples I'm going to be using today, they're not huge spreadsheets. I like to keep them fairly simple, just so it's a lot easier for you to kind of see what I'm doing. However, the techniques and tools that I'm going to be showing you apply no matter how much data you have on the page. It's all the same. So a very small data set. But this is a pivot table, and if you're new to pivot tables, this will look a little bit strange. We've got our actual table of data on the left-hand side, and then over in the right-hand side, we have this pane for the pivot table fields. Now, what you can see that we have here in the top is we have all of our column headings. These are so department, quarter, and sales. And then underneath, we have these four areas, and you'll see that quarter is under the columns, and if you look at your data, you'll see that the quarters are listed here, so they are in the columns. We have department in our rows, and we do, those are our departments listed in our rows. And then our sales, so those are our actual sales figures, are in the values area, and the values area is kind of this area just here. So that's the way that I've constructed this pivot table. And what I can do very easily is I can pivot that pivot table just by dragging and dropping these headings around into these different areas. That's essentially what you do when you're pivoting a pivot table. And I'll just show you very quickly. I'm going to drag quarter down to rows, and you'll see that the way that that data is now displaying has changed. Okay, and that's essentially, we've done our first pivot of a pivot table. So that's kind of what we're aiming for. We're going to go from the beginning now. We're going to create a pivot table from our raw data. We're going to do a little bit more pivoting, moving things around, and then getting into some of the more sort of intermediate features of pivot tables as well. But I just wanted to show you that because sometimes it's hard to envision where you're going when you're actually kind of on the journey. So it's always good to have a look at the end points. Right, let's close that down, and there is going to be a lot of jumping around spreadsheets today. I do apologize for that. And we're going to open up the Format Data worksheet. Now, in this first exercise that we're doing, we're actually going to concentrate on the raw data. So before you create your pivot table, you obviously need some data to go in that pivot table. And that data, when it's in its unedited, unformatted state, that's what we refer to as the raw data. So I've got that information just here. We've got department, quarter, and sales again. Then we have our different departments and the sales figures for each quarter, essentially. Now, what it's really important to do before you create your pivot table is make sure that that data is clean, or what we call clean. So you want to make sure that you don't have any erroneous numbers, you don't have any blank rows, anything like that in your data. It should be good, clean data. Otherwise, you might have problems when you create your pivot table. And I just like to show you some tools which I find really useful when I'm creating pivot tables, tools which I like to use to essentially clean my data before I do a pivot table. Now, what I've done before, because this is an exercise, I've actually kind of added a few things in here. So you'll probably see just here in cell A18, we've got kind of the word sport, but it looks a little bit strange. And you might encounter this because we're in a controlled environment here, so all the data I tend to use is as it should be. But as we all know, life isn't like that. You might have been sent a spreadsheet from someone else, or you might have imported it from somewhere, and sometimes your data doesn't come across perfect for your pivot table. So you might have to do a few things just to clean that data up. One of the things which I always like to check for, is duplicate records. So occasionally you might find that there's a duplicate row or a duplicate column, something like that. And there's a very quick way to search for duplicates. If you go up to the data ribbon, and then go across to the Remove Duplicates button at the top here in the Data Tools group. And that will just do a quick scan of your data, and it's going to ask you where do you want to search. And you can see it's highlighted where it's going to look for duplicate records. So I'm going to keep all of those selected and click on OK. And you can see it's found one duplicate value. Now, I did put in a duplicate value in there just to demonstrate this. So good, it's picked it up. I can click OK, and I now know that each one of those values is a unique value. So a nice quick way of removing duplicates from your data. Another thing you want to make sure is that you don't have blank rows. So I'll just quickly add a new row in there. So if your data looks something like that, you might have one or more blank rows through it. You need to remove all of those blank rows. Okay. If you don't, what will happen is the pivot table will either create the pivot table based on the data above the blank row, or just the data below the blank row. It won't do it all as a whole. So blank rows need to come out as well. So make sure that you are removing those. Another thing you want to ensure is that your data is consistent throughout your raw data. So again, if I go back to the example, if we go down to cell A12, you can see here we've got play, but it looks different to the rest of them. It's got a lowercase p, and the same with sport, we've got an uppercase T. Now there is a quick way to make all of our data consistent, and that is by using a very quick, a very simple formula. So I'm just going to click in cell D2, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the word equals, and depending on how you want it to look, so I want everything to have an uppercase first letter and everything else in lowercase. And there is a formula which will turn text into uppercase first letter, everything else lowercase, and it's called proper, for proper case, I'm assuming. And we can do an open bracket, and you can see underneath it's telling us what it's requiring. So I'm going to say apply the proper function to A2. I'm going to close that bracket, and I'm going to hit enter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that down by using my autofill handle. So I'm going to double click to copy down. And most of these are correct anyway, but if we go back to that one in A12, you'll now see that it's corrected it. So now the P is in uppercase, and if we go down to our other one, sport, just here, that looks correct as well. So very quickly, using that proper command, we can sort out all of those words. Another thing you might want to do, I'm just going to undo out of there, is use the trim command. Now, the trim command is used if you have erroneous spaces in your words. So if I had maybe like a space like that, which you can again see if you've imported data from a database, sometimes you might have spaces at the end, spaces in the middle that you want to remove. And you can do that using the trim command. Again, very simple command. Open brackets, select the first cell, press enter, and then copy that down. Doing the same thing, double clicking. Now, if you want to do both proper and trim, you can combine them together, which obviously is going to be a lot easier because you're doing two things in one. So again, we could just do equals proper. So this is just combining two. Then we're going to do trim. She says, yep, sorry. And then we're going to open the bracket and we're going to do A2. And then we're going to close. Remember, whenever you must close off all of the brackets that you use. So because I've got two open brackets, I need to end with two closed brackets. Otherwise, that formula is not going to work. So this is kind of a formula inside a formula, which is going to perform both proper and trim at the same time. If I hit enter, I can then copy that down by double clicking. So that's a nice way, or some tools which you can use. Now you're probably thinking, well, now we've got all of our clean data in column D, I want to copy it back across to column A. So you might think that you would do Control C and then a Control V, but you're going to find that that doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because, again, if we undo, we've got formulas in here that are referring to a specific cell. So now that I'm moving, that's messing up the formula. So what you need to do is once you have your clean data, you copy it, so Control C to get our little marching ants around the outside. But when you paste it, you want to do a special paste instead of just a regular Control V. Now, special paste is on the home ribbon. In this clipboard group, we have paste. Now, instead of just clicking the top button, which will essentially do a Control V, if you click the lower half, that gives us more of our pasting options, and we can choose how we want to paste. So I'm going to click Paste Special at the bottom, and I'm going to say just paste the values. So don't paste the formulas underneath, just the text essentially. And I'm going to do OK. And now if I look down just to check, and I can see, yep, so that's worked. So all the plays are correct and all the sports are correct. So that is how you can clean up your data and paste it across, and then you can just delete out that one. So just a couple of little tools in there for you. Now, what I also like to do before I do my pivot table is convert my raw data to a table prior to making it into a pivot table. And there are a couple of advantages to formatting your data as a table. You don't have to do it, but I find it more useful to format as a table first. You can leave your data like this and create a pivot table, no problem. Now, formatting as a table. Again, if we go to our home ribbon, make sure that you're clicked in your table first of all, and go across to the styles group just here, and you'll see you have an option for format as table. And when I click it, I get lots of different formatting options. Now, I know some people think that this is just essentially a quick way of formatting your table, which it kind of is, but it's a little bit more functional than that. So I'm just going to select this one just here. It's going to say, where is the table? And it's selected it, so that's fine. And we can do OK. So what that's now done is it's applied some formatting, so it's a little bit easier to differentiate the headings from the text. It's given us some filter drop-downs, which can be useful. But the thing that I think it's good the reason why I think it's good to do this before creating a pivot table is that if you then need to add any data into your data source, so maybe you need to add something onto the bottom of it, when I add a new entry, it automatically includes it in the table, which you can see that the border is now automatically wrapped around, which means that the pivot table will update correctly. You don't have to go in and select a cell range like you would do if you hadn't already put it in a table. So that's why I like to use tables. Let's just undo out of there. So I've got my data in a table. And incidentally, when I created this table, it actually names it automatically as table 1 in Excel when I created that table. I could change that if I wanted to, but at the time, for now, I'm going to leave it as table 1. And we're going to use this to create our pivot table. So you'll see how simple this is. So click in your raw data, whether you have it in a table or not, go to the Insert ribbon, and you'll see the first group here, which is called Tables. The first option is Pivot Table. So let's click. So we have a dialog box come up which gives us some options. So the first thing it's telling us is select a table or range. Now because I was clicked in my table, Excel has correctly picked up that I want to use the data that's surrounding where I'm clicked, and you can see it's picked up the name of the table, Table 1. If for some reason it doesn't pick everything up correctly, which most of the time it does, you can just go in and highlight the cells as well if you want to. Moving down to the lower half, it's saying, where do you want me to create the pivot table? So on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. So I could choose to put it on the same page as my raw data. I don't tend to like to do that. I like to have them separate. So I always select new worksheet here, but again, that's entirely up to you how you want to do that. So let's select new worksheet and click on OK. All right, so now we can see, if you just cast your eyes down to the bottom of the screen, we now have 2 tabs, Sheet 2 and Sheet 1. So if we click back on Sheet 1, you'll see that's where our raw data is. And I always just then like to go in and name my tabs so I can keep track of what's on what page. So I'm just going to call this raw data. And I'm going to name Sheet 2, I'm just going to rename that Pivot Table because that's where it's going to be, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. So when you first create the pivot table, you'll actually really have nothing on there apart from this pivot table report builder essentially. What you will have though is on the right hand side, you'll have your pivot table fields pane. And you can see what it's done is it's picked up all of my column headings, department, quarter, sales. If you go back to our data, department, quarter, sales. So it'll automatically import all of your column headings. You can then drag and drop these column headings down to these bottom areas down here, depending on how you want your table to look. And sometimes this can be, I guess, a little bit of trial and error. Sometimes it takes a few kind of pivots to kind of get it into a state that you want to extract the information that you need. So let's first of all just drag department down 2 columns, and you'll see as I let go, it's going to start to build my pivot table. So I now have my departments listed across the top, so in columns. I'm now going to take quarter and I'm going to put that in my rows area by dragging and dropping. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 listed in the rows. And sales, I'm going to drag into the values area. Normally, the bulk of the data that you're going to be displaying will be put into the values area, whether it's sales or counts or averages or whatever it might be. And that's how my pivot table looks in this configuration. So quite nice and easy to read. What I could then do is, if I wanted to display this in a different way, as we saw before, is just drag and drop these around to get it to display in different ways. And we're going to do a little bit more on this in a moment, but one of the areas which we haven't really touched on is this filters area. We've dragged our fields down to the other 3, but not filters. So I'm just going to drag departments across to filters so you can see what that looks like. So now we've got our quarters, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we've got our total number of sales for each quarter. But we can now go into departments. The filter creates a filter, essentially a drop down, and we can refine it for a specific department. So if I want to see the data for the work department, I can select that and click OK, and that data will update. So it gives me a little filtering option if I want it like that. So that's quite nice as well. I'm going to put that back into columns. Lovely. So we're going to come back to this again in a moment. I'm just going to close this spreadsheet down and show you another way that Excel makes it really easy for you to create a pivot table. Actually, let's open that again. I don't think I meant to close that down. Sorry. Okay, So we're going to use this data again in our second example. Now, if you're not sure where you want your or where you should move your fields to, and sometimes in pivot tables that's the hardest thing, is where to place those fields to get it to display in a way that you want. Now, Excel has something that can help you with that, and it's on the insert ribbon. And again, it's in this tables group, and it's called recommended pivot tables. And what this button will do is if we click it, Excel is going to look at the kind of data that we have, and it's going to recommend some pivot tables for us. And whichever one we select, it will automatically create that pivot table, so we don't have to drag and drop the columns around. So I can scroll through and look at some of my options. So here I've got my departments and my sum of sales. Yeah, that's not bad. Got lots of different ones. Now this one here, that's pretty much the one which we just created manually. So I might think, okay, yep, that's the one I want. I'm going to select it, click OK, and it's already placed all of the fields in the correct areas for me. So recommended pivot tables is a really good way of being able to create a pivot table really quickly and be able to see that end result. Lovely. Okay, so again, let's just take a very quick look as we're on this pivot table at just pivoting that data around. So again, I can drag and drop. What should we do? Let's drag. In fact, let's use a different spreadsheet. Let's close this one down. And we're going to go to Create Pivot. Actually, that's not the one I want. Sorry about that. Seem to have lost my exercise. Just bear with me. There it is. All right, so we've got slightly different data in this one. So same thing, we've created a pivot table. We have slightly different headings in here. So we've got year, quarter, customers, region currently isn't selected. So it's not in any of our areas at the bottom here. So we can now pivot this pivot table around if we want to. So I'm going to drag region to the columns area, and you can have more than one in particular areas. So you can see how that now changes the way that this pivot table looks. Some kind of don't really make sense when you move them around, but others you might think, yep, that's really, really useful. I might decide to drag region over to rows instead and place it underneath year. So that looks like that. So that kind of gives me more of a breakdown. Or I might want to put region in filters. It really depends how you want it to look. You can either reorder them within each area. So if I wanted region to be above year, I could just drag it above like so, and it orders it slightly differently there as well. So as I said, a little bit of trial and error when it comes to moving those fields around. What you'll also notice is when we've got them grouped like this, you'll see that you have next to 2012 and 2013 little collapse and expand buttons as well. So again, they're just there to help you kind of really focus in on the data that you want just by collapsing up data that's not needed or data you don't want to focus on at that particular time. So nice and easy. Lovely. Okay, so let's close that down. Hopefully you can start to see that it's really simple to create them. It's actually really simple just to move them around. Hopefully you can see that. All right. Let's take a look at some of our configuration options when it comes to pivot tables. So, new exercise open, configuring. And there are lots of tools available to you to manipulate your pivot table. Now, when you're clicked in your pivot table, if you cast your eyes to the top of the screen, you might notice that we now have what we call a contextual ribbon. So here it is, pivot table tools, and we have two sub-ribbons, analyze and design. These contextual ribbons, you're probably familiar with them. They're throughout all of the Office applications. They only appear when they're needed. So when I click outside of the pivot table, those ribbons disappear. When I click inside, they come back again. And I can basically find all the tools that I have for managing, formatting my pivot tables on these two ribbons. So Analyze, which we're clicked on now, has a few different options which I can use for my pivot table, whereas Design tends to focus more on how that pivot table looks and lets us change the formatting, add rows or banded rows and columns, and also add some layout options as well. Let's just go back to the Analyze tab for a moment. You'll see right over on the right-hand side in the Show group, there are 3 buttons which are currently all selected. Now, we were just talking about these Collapse and Expand buttons. You can get rid of them altogether. So if you don't want them showing at all, if you just click the button for it, it will get rid of them like so. So that's a toggle button. All 3 of these are toggle buttons. Field headers, we can turn that off and on as well if you want to get rid of just the field headers. And also field lists. So this pane here, this large pane that's almost taking up half the screen, this is your field list essentially. And if you want to get rid of that, if you just click on field list, that will take it away again. Now, I can't tell you how many calls I used to get when I used to work on the help desk many moons ago, but people saying, I don't know where my pivot table fields list has gone. You can get it back very simply by clicking on the field list button to bring it back. Or if you click inside your, I thought if you clicked in the pivot table it came back. Obviously not. I was wrong there. Field list. I have a memory of once being able to click in the pivot table and the pivot table fields would come back, but it doesn't seem so. So field list will allow you to toggle that off and on. Lovely. Now, so far, we've been taking a look at examples that allow that we're using raw data, which we already have in an Excel spreadsheet. Now, as I said, a lot of the time you may be receiving data from somebody else. So maybe it's from a client who's sending you an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe it's maybe you do an import from a database that gives you your raw data. It might not be an Excel spreadsheet that you've created. So I'm going to show you how to create a pivot table and import the raw data from an external source. Again, it's very, very simple. So let's close down this exercise. And we're not going to save that one. And we're going to open up the Connect spreadsheet. All right, so we have nothing currently on here because we're going to import our data. And we just go back to the Insert ribbon and we go to the Pivot Table option. So this should look familiar. This is where you come if you're just creating a regular pivot table. But this time, because we've got no data, it says select a table or range, which we don't have, or we can use an external data source. So that's what we're going to do. And underneath, it's then telling us to choose connection. And the terminology connection is because a lot of the time people may want to connect to an external database. So a lot of people may have an internal system which they use. You can connect to internal systems, not necessarily Microsoft systems or anything like that, but maybe you have an accountancy system. I know a lot of accountants can import their files into Excel through here as well. So we're going to do something a little bit more basic than that, simply because we don't have a huge database to import, but we can if we have it in an Access file, which could be another place that you're storing your data. I'm going to click Browse for More at the bottom. And that will just allow me to go off and browse to the location where I have my file stored, whatever that file might be. So I'm going to go back and find my file. And I'm going to use this one here. So it's called Data Source. And I don't know if you can see the little icon underneath there. It's actually an Access file. So Access is just Microsoft's sort of database design system. So we've got a data file in there, which we're going to use. And I'm going to click Open. And then I'm going to click on OK. And what you can see is that even though we can't see the raw data, it's picked up all of the column headings from that particular Access file. And I can then go in and build my pivot table. So again, depending on how you want it to display, I can start dragging things around. So I might put sales in the values. What else might we want to do? Maybe we do month, something along those lines. You get the idea, and we can go through and we can pivot those, move them around, do whatever it is that we want to do with them. So again, really simple just to import data from an external source as well. Now, something else that you might want to do with regards to the kind of data that you're using in your pivot table is consolidate data. So that might be data across different worksheets as we've got here, or different workbooks. So you can see that we've got at the bottom 3 tabs: support calls, order calls, and return calls for different regions. So we're showing data for all the support calls for 2010 to 2013 for the north, south, east, and west, total number of calls. Now you'll notice that the data is all in exactly the same format, and by that I mean that it's for the same time period, so 2010 to 2013, and it's for the same regions on each page. Even though the values change, the actual layout is the same, and that's really important if you are trying to consolidate lots of different pieces of information into one pivot table, which is what we're going to do now. We're going to take all of the information on each page, combine it together into one pivot table. But the point I'm trying to make is the important thing here is that you don't have anything that's different. So I can't have this saying 2010 to 2013 and then in the order calls one having 2014 on here as well. It's just going to throw off the data. So as long as your data is the same but the figures are different, then this is going to work absolutely fine. So let's go back to support calls. And for this, we need to use something called the PivotTable Wizard. Now, in Microsoft's wisdom, they removed the PivotTable Wizard from the toolbar, so not toolbars, I'm going old school now, ribbons, I say. Wow, it felt like 1997 there for a moment. Yeah, they removed it from the ribbon for some reason. So now, in order to find or bring up the PivotTable Wizard, which is what you need to do if you want to consolidate data from multiple spreadsheets, you have to know the shortcut key. So, and it's not the easiest to remember, so it's a little bit tricky, but the shortcut key is Alt, D, and then P, okay? And you press them independently. So if I press Alt, D, P, there we go. All right, so don't hold them all down at the same time, just press them individually. And that will take you into the PivotTable Wizard, which is sort of kind of hidden right now. So it's telling us where is the data that you want to analyze. So we've got Microsoft Excel list or database, external data source, or multiple consolidation ranges. So that's the one we want to select. And then it said, what kind of report do you want to create? Do you want to create a pivot table or do we want to do a pivot chart? So you can select either of these. We're focusing on pivot tables, so I'm going to leave that selected and click on the next button. I love wizards because they really do just like walk you through the process. It's nice and easy. So now it says you can create a pivot table report that uses ranges from 1 or more worksheets. Great, and that has no page fields or up to 4 page fields. So don't worry too much about the whole page fields thing. If you just select, I will create page fields. I always select that every single time. So just select that and click on next. And now we can tell Excel what page or what cell ranges we want to use. So my cursor is flashing in range. So I'm going to go to my first worksheet, which is support calls, and I'm going to select the data that I want to use on the first page. And I'm going to click add, and it will add it into this all ranges area underneath. What I would then do is go to my next page, so order calls, and do the same thing. Select the range and click add. So we're kind of building up a little list. I'm going to go to return calls, do exactly the same thing, and click on add. And you'll carry on going through. So maybe you've got data which is split up into months, so January to December. You would go through and you'd select each tab and then select the data. We're going to, again, with this page fields, we're going to leave it on the default, which is 0, and we're going to click next. And then again, it's going to say, where do you want me to create this consolidated pivot table, on a new worksheet or on an existing worksheet? So I'm going to say new worksheet and click finish. And there we go. What it's done is it's consolidated all of that data across those three worksheets and pulled them all into one pivot table. And you can then go in and start to pivot your data as you might. Okay, so that's just a way of consolidating your data as well. Lovely. So let's close that down. And we're going to go to the Managing Spreadsheet and just start to take a little look at a couple of other things which you might need to do with your pivot table. So what you can do is name your tables. Now, I'm a big fan of naming things in Excel. I find it so useful. Instead of, particularly when I'm doing things like formulas and I want to refer to a specific group of cells, instead of going in and selecting the range of cells every single time, I prefer to name all of my cell ranges, and then it's much easier just to use them in formulas and in other areas as well. So again, if I click in my pivot table, a quick way of selecting the entire pivot table is to click in there and do Control A on your keyboard. That will just highlight the entire table. You could also, if you wanted to, use the ribbons at the top, and if we go to the Analyze ribbon, I think it's on, yes. In the Actions group, you have a Select box, and that will allow you to select the entire pivot table as well if you want to do it that way. Personally, I find it quicker just to do a Control A. And just here you have a name box. As I hover over it, you'll see it says name box, and I can click in here and I can give my pivot table a name. So I'm going to call it dept underscore quarter. Really important when you're naming your pivot tables or using this name box, you don't have any spaces in the name. Okay, so you can separate with underscores, but no spaces, like so. And now I have my pivot table named in there. So I can also use this for navigating as well. If I'm on a completely different sheet, like this one for example, and I want to jump very quickly back to my pivot table, I can just click the drop down, select the range, and it will jump me straight back to where I need to be. So not only is it good for being able to use it in formulas, which I'm not going to go into in this session, but you can also use it to kind of jump around and navigate. So just a little tip there, keeping things organized with named ranges. Now, some other things that you might want to do is you might have a pivot table created which you then want to copy and paste somewhere else. And again, there's nothing different about this at all. Control A, Control C, and then you can go somewhere else and paste it in. So if we go to the PT paste area, the only thing I would say with this is just make sure where you're clicked, because wherever you're clicked on the page, that's where it's going to put that pivot table. Okay, so I was clicked in the middle and it's over there. If you want it in A1, make sure that you are clicked in cell A1 when you paste it in. Lovely. Now, if for some reason you get completely in a mess with your pivot table and you just kind of think, ugh, I just want to start again, you can clear out, essentially reset your pivot table. Again, on the ribbon, if we go to the Analyze ribbon, we have a clear option. So in this Actions group, if we click the drop down and do Clear All, that's going to take all the data out of there and take us back to the beginning, and we can then re-drag our headings around. So just a couple of things for managing your pivot tables in there. Now, let's take a look at some tools which you might find really useful when you're summarizing your data. So again, we're just going to go back to a very simple pivot table. We can see we've got our regions at the top, east, north, south, and west. We've got our quarters listed in the columns, and we also have some grand totals listed on here. Now this grand total you can see in the column F and in row 15. These you can turn off and on. You can manage grand totals and subtotals, which you may not have noticed because it's quite hard to read. These here are actually subtotals. I'm not used to seeing subtotals above figures. Like, subtotals to me should always be below the figures, but the way this pivot table is, they're currently sitting above the data that they're representing. Now, I want to change that because I can't read it. I find it very difficult to read. I kind of mistake it for actual data. So I'm going to move my subtotals down to the bottom, and I'm also going to turn off this grand totals area because I don't need them. So I'm going to click in my pivot table, and I'm going to go to the design ribbon. I can never remember where they are. The design ribbon. Now the first group we have here is the layout group, and this is very simple. You can see here you've got subtotals and grand totals. So I'm just going to change the default. For subtotals, I'm going to select show all subtotals at bottom of the group. And you can see that they're now moved down underneath the data. I can also go in and turn off the grand total. So I can choose to have it off for both rows and columns, or on for rows and columns, on for rows only, or on for columns only. So if I select columns only, sorry, rows only that was, I've still got it listed at the bottom just here. I could do off for both rows and columns. So you do have a couple of little tools in there as well which will help you out. Now, when you have data such as this, I'm actually going to put my totals back on for rows and columns. So this data that we have, by default, Excel will do a sum of your data. So this is essentially doing a sum. It's adding it all up for each of these regions and each of these quarters. You can, whilst you're in your pivot table, without affecting the underlying raw data, you can extract other information out of your pivot table. So for example, if I wanted to see averages instead of totals, then I can do that from here. I don't have to go to my original source data and redo the pivot table. Click anywhere in your pivot table and right-click the mouse, and you'll have an option for Summarize Values By. And you'll see currently it's got sum selected, so that's why it's doing a sum of our data. If I wanted to display the averages, I can select average. And these have now changed down here. Now it's worth noting the actual data doesn't change. This section here doesn't change. It just changes the total. So instead of seeing a sum, I'm now seeing an average. I could then choose to do it by, if I do summarize values, by the maximum value. And you can see now it says that 611 is the maximum value in this row. And if I just do a quick integrity check, I can see that yes, 611 is. I'll do it on a couple of them. 651, yep, 729, so on and so forth. So there is a quick way of summarizing your results without affecting that underlying raw data, which is really, really nice for just kind of extracting information out and seeing what you need to see. I'm just going to switch that back to sum, like so. Another little option that you have, again, it's within the same area. So if we right-click the mouse, we have a show values as, and there's lots of things which you can do in here as well. It really kind of changes how the data is displayed again. So for example, I might want to see these figures as a percentage of the grand total. So if I select that, it changes my figures. Remember, again, it's not touching our underlying raw data, which we can see there. Okay, it's just showing me that which I've asked it to show. So now it's summarizing as a percentage of the grand total. So I can see that 2012, the grand total was 51.27% of the actual grand total. Okay, and then 2013 was 48.73. So essentially this one and this one should add up to 100 when you put them together. And all of these should add up to make this figure down here. Okay, so there's a whole host of options in show values as, and it's good to have a little play around with those, see which ones you might use, running totals, rank smallest to largest, things like that. So lots of things that you can do within there as well. Lovely. Now let's close this one down and open up our slicer worksheet. I love slicers. They're one of my favorite little things. I just find them really useful, and I don't know if any of you are kind of into creating dashboards in Excel. I know that they're becoming a little bit more popular, and I think we're probably going to do a webinar on that in the coming weeks because it's something that's really taking off in Excel, creating these interactive dashboards to display information with KPIs and lots of things going on, so pivot tables, charts, slices, all different kinds of things happening in these dashboards. So if you're not familiar with slicers, they are a great little utility. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a slicer into our pivot table. And I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. Just going to drag that over. So again, we have data that we've been working with the whole time. So we've got our regions, we've got our quarters, and then we've got our data and our grand totals running down the side and across the bottom. Now I'm just going to, remove region from here and just take it down to something like that. Now, what I could do is instead of having everything in the field areas like this, I might decide to put region back and add region as a slicer instead. So I'm going to go to my Analyze ribbon and I'm going to do Insert Slicer. And it's asking me, what do I want to insert my slicer for? And again, it's giving me those column headings. So those should match with what I have in my pivot table fields area, which they do. And I'm going to select region and click on OK. And it gives me a little panel like this, which I can resize by dragging up and down. And I also have, if we look up at the ribbons, slicer tools, and I have an options ribbon which gives me all of my options to control my slicer. So we don't have a great deal of things in here, but we could change the color of our slicer if we wanted to, and you can add as many slicers onto your page as you like. And what they do is they act as a visual filter. So I could then click East, and it's just going to show me the data in my pivot table for the region East. I could select South, and now I'm seeing the data for South. So it works essentially very much like the filter option, but it's a very visual way. And you could probably see if you're sending quite a complex pivot table to somebody who maybe doesn't have too many Excel skills and you want to make it easy for them to be able to extract information, slices are really simple because most people can look at this and think, oh, I just have to click. They don't have to do anything with the pivot table. And you can add as many of these on as you want. So we could add another one in. So let's just do one very quickly. So insert slicer, and I could do it for quarter if I wanted to. Add that on, and you can actually start to make these look really nice. When you create your dashboards, you can make them look very visually appealing, visually interesting. So I could change the color of that as well. And I can then combine my slicers. Now, if you want to, when you're using these slicers, you don't have to just select one option. You can select multiple. So if I want to see the data for both the East and the West, I can just select both of them by holding down my Control key when I click as well, and that data will update. Okay, so slicers, I love them. They're just a nice little way of representing your data. Lovely. Let's close that down. And I realise we're coming up to time, but I've just got a few more things to show you, so I'll just try and squeeze those in before I leave you this afternoon. Okay, so we've got a slightly different looking pivot table here, but the same theme. So we've got our year, quarter, region customers down the side, and you can see that those have been placed into the different areas. Now what we're going to do with this pivot table is we're just going to format it a little bit. At the moment it looks kind of boring, kind of plain, and formatting is actually very important in Excel because it just makes things a lot easier to read and interpret. So I'm going to click in the pivot table again and go back to my pivot table tools ribbon, the design ribbon. And I'm going to apply some formatting. So I'm just going to add a pivot table style like so, just so that those column headings stand out a little bit more. What I can also do is I have other options up here. So I have things like banded rows, banded columns. It really depends how you want it to look. So you can have a little play around with those. Some other visual elements that you can add into your pivot tables are, you can utilize, what I meant was you can utilize conditional formatting to add some other visual elements into your pivot table, which can be really, really useful. Again, I don't know if you're that familiar with conditional formatting. If not, if we go to the Home ribbon, this is your conditional formatting button just here. And again, there are quite a few options that you have which you can use in your pivot table. And again, this is just to make your pivot table really easy to interpret and to read. So I'm going to show you a couple of little options in here as well. So make sure you're clicked in your data. We're going to go to conditional formatting, and the first thing we're going to use is highlight cell rules. And I'm going to select greater than. Now, what this will do is it's going to highlight in my data any cells that are greater than the number that I provide. So looking at this, I might want to say highlight cells, and with the light fill and dark red text, with data that's greater than, let's say, 400. Oh, sorry. Let me backspace. Sorry, I needed to highlight my table. Control A. Otherwise, it's just going to apply it to that cell. So greater than 400. Lots of things in there. I'm not doing a good job of this. Hang on. Let's just do it on a little bit of data, although it's going to do the whole lot. There we go. That's better. That's what I was looking for. Okay, so you can put in a condition and it will apply that to the page. You could then do the same thing if you wanted to do it the other way. You could select different conditional formatting. So you could say less than if you wanted to highlight values less than, let's say, less than 300. Do we have anything less than 300? No, less than 320. And I'm going to select yellow fill with dark yellow text, like so. So you can really start to pull out that information using conditional formatting. What you can also do is add things like data bars, color scales, and icon sets to your data. This is all about just improving, making it look really visual and easy to read. So I could use data bars, and again, if we just select a column, data bars is just going to show us a graphical representation of the figures that are in the area that I've selected. Or I could choose to use icon sets, which again is a graphical way of representing data. Or I could choose to use a color scale, which is essentially like a heat map. If we just select the first one, to kind of bring a bit of context to the information. Now, this looks really ugly. I wouldn't suggest combining all of them into one pivot table. Maybe pick a couple of them, and I'm sure you can make it a lot nicer than I can, but hopefully you can see the point of that there. Particularly good if you're doing presentations, things like that. Nobody wants to sit there just staring at a wall of information. Make it visual, make it interesting, easy for people to read and interpret. And the very final thing I want to show you, because we are out of time, these sessions always go so quickly, is just very quickly how to create a pivot chart. So I'm going to come out of here and we're going to go to Create Pivot. Now, when you're creating a pivot chart, you first need to create a pivot, or you need to have raw data there essentially. So we're going to go to the Insert tab. And this time we're going to go across to the charts area. And you'll see you have an option for pivot charts. Let's click the drop down and select pivot chart. This is very simple. So it's saying again, select a table or a range, and I can see that it's picked up table 2, which is the name of this table. So I'm pretty sure that all my data that I need is going to be included. And then I need to select whether I want it on a new worksheet or existing. I'm going to select new and click on OK. And there we go. So now I have my pivot table ready to be created, and it's also going to create me a chart as soon as I start to drag these around to the different areas, like so. And you can see there very quickly I've created not only a pivot table, but a pivot chart based on that data as well. When you click on that pivot chart, you then have access to all of your pivot chart tools, which are all the normal things that you would find if you just created a regular chart. So if you're used to sort of adding regular charts, then you pretty much can't go wrong with pivot charts. It's exactly the same. We can go in, we can add axis titles, chart titles, legends, all those kinds of things, and format it exactly how you want. So very, very simple. And time is up. I'm so sorry. I feel like I've just like rambled through that completely, like one thing after another, but it's just trying to cram in as much as we can into the little time that we have. I hope you found that at least a little bit useful. I'll open for a couple of questions. I know we're running over time, so we'll just limit it to a couple of questions. But James, if you have any questions for me.
Yes, I do. So the first question is from Anna, and it was going back to the early part of the class, and it was: is there a quick way to find and remove blank rows?
A quick way to find, yes, there is. So let's go back to my data. Let's put in a blank row. Okay, so if we go to, I believe it's in, you can tell I've had a break from holiday. I'm like, oh. Where are we? There is an easy way to do this. I don't know why I can't remember. Hang on 1 second. It'll come to me. It'll come to me. This is what happens when you have 2 months off. You just forget everything you've ever known. I just can't remember where it is. Hang on. No, let's remove duplicates in there. There is a quick way of doing this. Hang on. I'm sorry, like my brain's gone completely blank. Let me just do a quick Google for you because it is super quick. I can't remember if I thought it was something like find and you can find the blank rows and remove them all in one go. But yeah, there you go. Go to special. That's what I thought it was. So blanks. So yeah, so we're in the right area. If we go back to home, and if we go to, where was it again? Go to special. Find and select. That's where I was. There we go. Go to special and blanks. And I think that will find all the blank rows in there. So it will highlight all the blank rows and then you press the delete key on your keyboard. I knew it was in find and select. It's where I was first of all. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit rusty. Next question.
That's no problem at all. Juliet wondered. She wondered whether or not, if she had a pivot table or chart, I guess, and she copied and pasted it somewhere, would it change the source pivot? If she, I guess what she's asking is if she'd created a pivot table, put it somewhere else, and changed one, would the other change as well?
Do you mean if you're adding data, will it update? Is that what you mean?
I think that's what the question is. Yeah.
If I understand the question correctly, if you mean, for example, if we go back to our raw data, so say we've created a pivot table off of this raw data, and then we have maybe we've updated the figures or something in here, will the pivot table automatically update? It won't. You need to refresh it. Okay, so there is a refresh button. So let's just very quickly just create a very quick pivot table. And we'll just drag these down here. Okay, so if the raw data changes, so if I make a change in here, the pivot table will not automatically update. What you need to do is refresh it, and you can see here there's a refresh button. So if you do refresh, then it will pull it through. This is why I would suggest always having your raw data in a table as well, because if the pivot table is referring to the data within that table range and you've added new data in, when you refresh that, that's going to update. Hopefully that's answered your question from what I was understanding from
Yeah,
James.
as far as I understand the question, that was the perfect answer, so that's great. And then there are no other questions except for people wondering where they can get a copy of the video tutorial. For those people who would like to get a copy of the webinar, please do just send an email to info@webinarsteam.com. That's webinars team, so WEBINARSTEAM.com, and info as in information, so INFO. I send I send an email out, obviously reminding people each week. In there is a link to the resources page. You'll find that on the last email that I sent. And if you want to go through there, you can find previous classes, including when this is uploaded. You can find the class there. And also, it will have the schedule for upcoming webinars on. So it's quite a good hub for if you're looking for more information. So with that, yeah, we're about 8 minutes over. I hope that's not been a problem for anybody, but it seems like everybody's still here. So thank you very much for everybody, and thank you so much to Deb. And yeah, I think we'll end it there. I'll be back again next week with another author. So until then, have a lovely week. Bye bye, everybody.